Hello, welcome everyone to this week's Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And this week we have a guest speaker again. One of our most frequent guest speakers is Bob Keeney of BKeeney Software, and he is going to be talking about using Xojo databases with ActiveRecord. It was a great way to simplify your database access. So Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everybody. As Paul said, my name is Bob Keeney. I am the founder of BKeeney Software. We are a Xojo consulting firm located in Kansas City. And we have been doing Xojo consulting for over 15 years at this point. And I'd say if I had to guess, 95% of our consulting work is database related, so we've come over the years with a need for something like ActiveRecord, and let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about a number of items. We're going to talk about common database coding problems that most of us will occur at some point in our Xojo coding career. We'll give an introduction to ActiveRecord, and we'll do a demo with RGen and ActiveRecord. RGen is our utility that creates the classes for us. And we'll have a Q&A session if there's any questions. So let's start with common issues. Well, if you've been doing any sort of database programming in Xojo for any length of time, you may or may not know that you should be checking for database errors. You might also have discovered that there's a tendency to have this spaghetti database coding. You might also have security errors, and you've probably also found out that Xojo doesn't help us very much. Now we'll get into each of these in detail. Let's talk about database error checking. If you've come from different languages and Xojo is not your first language, you may not know that Xojo does not throw exceptions for database errors. So, which means that after every transactional with the database, whether it be SQL select, SQL execute, insert record, you need to check for the database error. Now, there's a couple additional ones here that I didn't list, but if you're doing prepare statements, for prepared statements, when you do the prepare, you should check the error bit. If you're doing a table schema and a field schema, you might also want to check it as well. I recently ran into an issue with the table schema on SQLite. It was returning a nil because one of the tables that the user had created was actually a reserved name, and therefore it returned a nil record set, which I would say it was more of a Xojo error, but we changed the table name and it worked fine. But you need to check that database error. And because Xojo doesn't throw that exception for you, that's really, really important. Now, adding this error checking isn't really all that hard, but it can be a lot of extra code. You figure at a minimum, if, else, maybe a couple statements in there, that's 4 extra lines of code. We worked on a accounting application recently that had well over 1,000 transactional things. So between selects and executes and insert records and all that, that turned up being to almost 4,000 lines of extra code right there. Now, when it comes to spaghetti coding, Xojo doesn't really help us very much because it makes it really easy to add database code everywhere. And what I mean by everywhere, well, okay, you got a push button over here and you do an insert statement in there. And you've got a method over here that loads your database. And you've got a class over here that does updates for all this other stuff. Maybe it's an account balance. So your database code ends up being everywhere. And it makes it really hard to maintain itself with big projects. So if you've got a big project like an accounting application, you really want to make sure that things are kind of in a place that makes it easy to maintain. And Xojo by itself doesn't help matters any. And one of the other problems that comes with having things spread all over the place is your business logic is spread out. You might end up, like an accounting application, 4 or 5 different places that all update an account balance. Well, this is probably not a good choice, because if you change the business logic or you have to change something, that means you have to find all the instances where it's at. So the spaghetti coding makes this really hard to figure out. Also add in the fact that Xojo doesn't help us with the mismatch of logic for saving. So assuming you're using the internal records or the objects, you have to use a database record if it's a new record, and you have to use the record set if it's an existing record. So somewhere in there you'll have a if new record, go do this code, and if it's an update, go do this code. And that can be kind of tiresome and certainly boring after a while if you've got a couple thousand of those that you have to do. If we go on to security errors, we really should be using prepared statements. Now, prepared statements help us in a bunch of ways, and if you're not using them, you should start migrating towards them whenever you can. Prepared statements will allow us to get away from string escaping. I have a relative whose last name is O'Neill with that apostrophe, and if you've ever had your SQL or your database return an error after trying to insert data or update data because of an apostrophe, it's because of string escaping. Now, it's not very hard to do a string escaping, but what you really should be using is the prepared statements, because then you don't have to do any of that, and the code that's inside of Xojo will do that for us. And then finally, the last thing that prepared statements help us with is the SQL injection attacks. This is way more prevalent on web apps, but it's very common for an attacker to try and do, if they happen to know your table name and maybe a field, they might just start doing some stuff like maybe insert users where name equals admin and password equals blah, blah, blah. Well, prepared statements will help alleviate that. And if you're not using these on web apps, you really, really should. Now, our last issue that we have is that really Xojo doesn't help us very much. And when I say that, it has no table and field name awareness. You can type in 1,000 SQL statements. They can be completely wrong from the moment you start typing, and Xojo won't care. The only time you will know is if you get that database error on a transaction. So if you've mistyped the table name or a field name, you're kind of hosed, because you just won't know until you actually do field testing. Xojo also doesn't enforce data integrity between the database and the application. I mean, once it gets into the application, into the Xojo code, you're fine. But certain databases, like if you try and say, here's a date field that you've created on your table, and you say string value, well, Xojo will happily try and convert that. Likewise, if you said, here's my string value, and I'm going to try and put it into this date field, it could be that the database will happily allow this. This is really a big problem with SQLite. So really, there's nothing that Xojo knows to say, oh, hey, this is an integer field. I should really warn the user that, or the programmer, that this is an integer. It just doesn't do any of that for you. So what's great is Xojo is generic enough to be able to use lots of databases, but the problem is it forces you to do everything. So we came up with ActiveRecord, and we did this right after, oh gosh, probably 7 or 8 years of doing the same thing over and over and over again. And database coding has a tendency to be very, very repetitive. You get a record set, or you insert with a database record, and then you do this, and then you do that. And it got to be really annoying because we kept finding ourselves doing the same problems over and over again. Some of these we've just covered. So we wanted something that was all 100% Xojo code and native to Xojo. So it uses, in the background, it uses the standard database classes, database record, record set, SQL execute, things like that. And we wanted a way to abstract all of the main things that you want to do. So you want to create a new record, you want to load a record, save and delete. And now, while the load isn't exactly like the load here, it's pretty much the same thing. So we've got a find by ID shared method that we use on all of our classes that's equivalent of load. And the nice thing about this is that save, you don't care if it's a new record or if it's an update record. If you call delete on one that's not already saved, it just ignores it. It just eliminates the object because it doesn't need to be saved. Likewise, you create a new one, it's just a record set. It doesn't really care. You can treat it as a record set until you're done with it. Now, the general methodology that we're using on this is we create an overall namespace for our database, and we just call it data. And then we have a table, or a class, I'm sorry, a class for each table that we're registering in ActiveRecord. Now we register the classes so that we can match things up. On each class, we have a corresponding property for each field in the database. So if we have a person table, we will have a field for each, or a property for each field that's in that table. The other thing that's really cool about ActiveRecord is we've got all these events. So we've got events for before create, before update, before save, before delete, and we've got corresponding events for after create, after update, after save, after delete. We also have a validate event, which we created 7 or 8 years ago, and we found that we don't really use it very much because we have a tendency to put our validation code right next to the UI that's using it. And we've got a little, we'll show an example hopefully afterwards that does this. Because we are registering our table in our class, we do some integrity checks at startup. This allows us to see if we're missing any fields. So if Carol puts in a new field, the database developer, next time they run it and they go to register the table, it'll go, hey, you're missing a property on your class for this field, and it'll do it. But if you did that at runtime, it wouldn't affect anything. But at design time and debug mode, it will certainly flag the user, which is kind of nice because on a big project, fields get added all the time. We've also got compiler warnings, and this is obviously because it's class-based, we can tell right away that, oh, we're trying to put an integer into a string and vice versa. Now, this is all on the Xojo side. We're still not really cognizant, we're not really doing anything between the Xojo and database side of things, but we are trying to match those up closer earlier so that we know these things. And as with most classes in Xojo, we've got autocomplete. So you can go, here's my namespace, data, dot, here, list of tables, pick persons, and then you hit dot again, and it comes up with all of the methods that could be done on it and all the properties or fields that you want. And it's really nice because you don't have to remember anything. All you have to remember is hit dot. And generally I know if it's a string or an integer beforehand, so, or at least I have a guess, and I can type the first letter. We prefix all of our variables, so it makes this easier to figure out. So we just do .s, and then the list changes to all the strings that are in that class. And then probably the other cool thing is we've got built-in transactions, and we also have the ability to override transactions. Now, the built-in transactions mean that if you have like a parent record and then a whole bunch of children records, they're all the same transaction as long as you do it from one of the events. So the event the transaction will start, you'll save the parent record, and then after the after save event, you can say, all right, save all my children, and you might need to set the children's parent ID to the parent. So that's all the same transaction. So let's take a little bit look at how this works in reality. So over here on the left, we've got the SQL to create a table, and we've got an integer primary key, which is auto increment. So we have to have an integer primary key. Currently, we're not working with UUIDs or text primary keys, anything like that. Right now, integer is the only way to go. Here we have our properties, and then you can see over on the right, we've got tsysvar, which is a class, and it's in a namespace. I didn't show the namespace, sorry, but you can see that we've got properties to match everything that is on the table. And then we've got shared methods, which is created by Argen, but you can create your own, called find by AID and list. In reality, using these things is just as simple as every other object in Xojo. So this top one, we go dim record as data, which is our namespace .tsysvar. We load the record up by calling the shared method find by ID, load the ID in there, and then we set the new value for svar value, and then hit save. Behind the scenes, it doesn't care, or to us, it doesn't matter. We just hit save. And then the second one, we're doing the same thing. We're just creating a new instance, new data.tsysvar. We're putting the values into sysvar name, sysvar value, and then hitting save. Now I showed the the autocomplete here. We've got a clone method that's built in. We've got a delete method built in. You can see we've got the properties. We've got find ID. The ID method, which is at the very bottom here, hopefully you can see that. That is an overridden mirror property for the primary key. So if you just call it ID, it will put it back to I sysvar underscore ID. So, and then you don't see save on here, but again, save is generic to everybody. We'll talk a little bit about the events here. We've got before create event, and we've got the before update event. So the before create event, we're just saying me.dt created. Remember, that was just a property that, or a field that was in the table that was mirrored on the class. We just say new date. We've got a before update, and we've got me.dt modified is equal to new date. So that's as simple, that's all it takes to do a created and updated or modified date on this record. And now anytime this is called or used, the object is used, all this stuff is automatic. Now we could certainly do like a before, or like a after save event, and we use that quite a bit for the like an audit trail sort of thing. And it's really easy to add code in there because now you've got an audit trail that is everywhere that you don't have to do anywhere else. And it's kind of nice because all the business logic is kind of forced to be in here. Now, some of the advantages of ActiveRecord, I think they're pretty obvious. Faster development time. We've had projects that have had 200 tables in it and each have 50 fields on each table, and it takes us no time to develop the database code behind it. Now, it might take quite a bit of time to do the UI behind it, but for the most part, that's almost minimal. I mean, it's just hooking it up. And because of this autocomplete stuff, we got fewer database errors because we're never guessing what table names are or field names are. And honestly, that was the biggest error that we ever had. And we occasionally we get a database that the user has developed, and there'll be misspellings. So instead of name, it might be NMAE. Honest God, it happens every now and then. So at least with the autocomplete, we don't have to worry about that, and we don't make those problems. Another big advantage is consistency, and this is amongst users and projects. So we're working on a project right now where 3 of us have been working on it, and since we're all using ActiveRecord, there's really only a limited number of ways that any of us are going to use it, so we know exactly what to look for. If we've got a list form, we know that this might be an issue or that might be an issue, whatever. And then project-wise, same issue. We've got projects that we've worked at for haven't looked at in 5-6 years that all use ActiveRecord. It's really easy to go in and work on it because we already know exactly what's going on, how it was used. We might have some things where we've added things to ActiveRecord over the years, but for the most part, it's pretty much used the same way now than it was 7 or 8 years ago. Because we're using this whole database namespace and the classes, we really reduce our spaghetti code in the database. Really, the only places that really access the database is when we're creating a filter for a list field where we might say, oh, we're filtering on a name, so we might have to create a little SQL and then pass it into the class. But otherwise, all of our business logic and all of the database code itself is actually in the class. So we know that we're not going to have to go hunting through the code to find issues or add fields and all that. We talked a little bit before about how when we do the register method, we see that a field is, if a field has been added or it's been changed, we can sometimes, or we get the warning from ActiveRecord says, oh, hey, here's this field, but there's no class on the, or there's no property on the class to match it. That is a really handy thing on really big projects. How often have you added a class and then forgotten to do anything with it afterwards? At least now you've kind of got this mental warning or mental message that you need to add it, and certainly you can't really do much with it until you add that class or add that property to the class. One thing that's interesting that I don't know if we really planned on it at the time. I think we added it after the fact, but we've got a no save if no data change thing. So when we first create the object and load the data into it, we stash a copy of it away in a record, in a dictionary object. And then before the save event, we see if any data has changed. So we don't really actually save anything unless the data has changed. Now, one thing to be aware of is if you're changing stuff in the before update event, well, guess what? Your data has now changed, and so now it'll always save. So it might be something that you want to check, but otherwise, you can save all day long as you're not changing any of the properties, it won't save. We've already talked about the events. Those come in really handy. We've also mentioned at least a little bit the automatic transactions, and this also includes all of the children records that might be like invoice and invoice line items. The insert and update events all use prepared statements behind the scenes, so they're pretty secure. You take a little bit of a hit with the prepared statements, but it's not a big hit, speed hit. We've definitely seen that. We looked at one point to say, which way was the fastest, and they're all virtually in a dead heat as long as you're using transactions. Okay? A few milliseconds here or there generally doesn't mean anything. Our currently supported databases: SQLite, MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, KubeSQL. I think we sort of support Oracle. We've never been able to get it to work, an Oracle database to work here. So it's in there, but I don't know if anybody's actually used it. I would be remiss at talking about ActiveRecord if I didn't talk about some of its weaknesses, because it does have some. One thing, we require integer primary keys, and this is something that was built in real early on, and this includes many-to-many tables. So if you had a many-to-many table that had users and say accounts, I don't know what, you'd have a user ID column, an account ID column, and then some other column that had data in there. We still require that you have a primary key on that table that is integer auto increment. We just decided that too many things go wrong if we don't know exactly which record we're talking about, and this was the easiest way to do that. Currently, there's no foreign key awareness, and nulls are kind of a particular problem. We do handle dates that are null because that's kind of a special case, and we have a need for lots of null dates. But foreign keys, generally, if you want the foreign key to be null, you put a null in there, or if there's no foreign record, there's a null in there. But because integers in Xojo default to 0, that really screws things up. So we generally have the database not have that foreign key awareness, and then we just deal with it all internally because all of our business logic is there. That hasn't been a real problem. Triggers can generate some strange errors in ActiveRecord, and they're not really ActiveRecord issues. They're more database related. So we're just checking that error bit like we should in all good applications, and there'll be an error, and it'll have some pretty strange errors sometimes. And if you're using triggers, these can be issues. And certainly the foreign key constraints can cause some strange errors as well that aren't necessarily ActiveRecord, but they're more database related because ActiveRecord's not putting the right type of data in there, nulls instead of, it's putting zeros instead of nulls. Relational data has to be programmed by hand. There's just no, we might add some stuff later on to RGen to make this a little easier, but I think for right now, most people want to do it by hand. And well, you need to do it by hand right now. Sorry. So one of the other issues with ActiveRecord is it loads all fields from the record, and there's no real easy way to get around this. And every now and then somebody will go, well, I only want to show 3 fields. So why should I load the entire data? Well, an ActiveRecord may not be for you, or you might want to use the view class. And we've got a view class that's not public yet, but it will be sometime this summer. And one of the big things that slows everything down is blob fields. So if you've got a picture for your, like say, person table, you should probably put that in a separate table anyway, and then only load it when you need it. And that way everything gets a little easier to deal with from a speed standpoint. Because it's loading all fields, you don't have a choice. You can't just say, oh, I only want these fields, but that's where a view would come in handy. Sorry, folks, I keep hitting the wrong button here. Certainly one of the problems with ActiveRecord at this point is the class creation is kind of tedious. If you're dealing with lots of tables, it can be real tedious to create those. We created RGen, which is the ActiveRecord generator, which does the classes, and you can just import them into your project at that point. The view-based class, that's not released to the public yet, but that's a way of simplifying the number of fields that you're loading up at any given time. Part of the reason for having a view-based class rather than just using the ActiveRecord-based class is because the ActiveRecord-based class has the before-after events. While you can't do anything, there's also a check in there to make sure it has a primary key. Well, with the view, you don't have a primary key. You might have a primary key to another table on there, but and then certainly the view you can limit the number of fields that you're doing. And then there's no support for ODBC at this point. Not that it can't be added. We've just never had any projects that require ODBC, so we've not done any formalized testing on it. And if you're using any of the non-Xojo database classes like the Monkeybread SQLite classes, we don't support them because everything is a subclass of the Xojo database. All right, so we talk a little bit about RGen here. It's our ActiveRecord utility. It's 1995. It reads the database structure, and it'll generate all the Xojo classes it requires. We've got ActiveRecord support classes, and then it will generate the database namespaces. And then one of the other options we have in there is we do prefixes. Some people ask for postfixes. And then some people didn't want anything, so they just wanted the plain table name in there, so that's one of the options. So before I get into the demo, I'm going to go in and answer some questions here. So the first question is, where is the best point for error checking in a prepared statement? Right after binding or right after the SQL select? Actually, I believe the best place to put that is right after the prepare statement itself, because if there's an SQL error, it's going to be right there. Now, I am not an expert on this, but you also might want to have an error after the SQL select, but at that point it may be too late. I'm not entirely sure. So I hope that answers that question. This next question is about the class properties. Can I make use of calculated properties? And the preface is where I interface with the calculated property and have ActiveRecord deal with the protected property, which is set by the calculated properties. And the answer is yes, we do this all the time. We have the field itself, and generally not necessarily with the straight data types, but the relational data types, or related data, will have the computed property so that it's pointed back to something. It handles the interface of saying, okay, like say user is going to have an account ID associated with it. So what they'll end up doing is we'll say, here's the account, here's the user ID, here's the account. We're going to set the overall account to this user. And then when we do that through the computer properties, we say, oh, account ID equals to whatever was passed in. And the property will do it that way. Hopefully that answers that question. And you can certainly contact me through email to get more information on this. All right, so the next question is more than one client accessing the database. How has record locking been done? Well, okay, so record locking is not something that's built in. What we recommend is using a optimistic record locking. So when you open it up, you take a look at the value that's in the last modified, and then before you hit save, you do a quick query back to the same object or the same table, same record in the database, and go, have I been modified since the last time I looked? And if the answer is yes, then you have to go, oh, I'm going to do this, but it's not built into ActiveRecord. The next one is, how can I use a prepared statement like query to prevent SQL injection? That's a question that you should ask on the forums and look in the documentation. We don't have the time for that here. Would it be reasonable to think of the validate event being useful or used for unit testing? It could. It's really up to you. And then same person, how is it best to go about implementing unit testing with ActiveRecord for QA? I really can't answer that. We don't do a lot of unit testing, so it just hasn't come out. But QA obviously has to, if I was going to do it, I would have to do an insert, have to do a select, and then do an update, and then have to do a delete. And certainly with unit testing, that wouldn't be hard to do. Next question is, reading the DB is how it works now. Would DDL reading be possible to have on the roadmap for AR? Don't know. I can't promise anything. So you can always email me later on if you want to get that added. And certainly you can add it yourself because it is open source. And then finally, have you thought about adding opportunistic locking into ActiveRecord? Thought about it, and it's possible it could get done in the summer. We've got some plans for doing, at least adding a moderate amount of stuff to it, like the view base class. We'd like to do some things with the generator, RGen, to make life a little easier. So perhaps that's something we could add in there. The problem is something like that isn't always used by everybody. So we want to make sure that just putting it in out of the box isn't going to screw up everybody's project, because the the record locking is done isn't going to screw up everybody else. So we have to do it in such a way that it's not going to mess up everybody. All right, so let's look at a project here, and got a database file here, and I'm just going to open it up in base right now. So you can see we've got a ton of tables and views, and we've got lots of fields on these things. And what we want to do is we want to create a Xojo application. So I'm going to start up RGen, and I'm going to create an SQLite database. Select the file, and it reads everything, all the tables, and we're just going to generate the classes, and it's generating the ActiveRecord classes, and we'll just call this db datafile.db.xml. Now if we hide this, we can see that we've got the XML file here. We're just going to drag this into Xojo. And that's something we'll have to fix. So resolve and click yes. So over here on the left-hand side, we've got our project. We've got our ActiveRecord class. We've got a database class that has a database exception, which we're not really using at this point. We've got some debug stuff, and we've got some ActiveRecord configuration. So if you're using different databases, sometimes these will be true or false. So the one you're using should be true. Otherwise, they need to be false. And then here's our namespace. So let's add this into a new tab. And here are all of the tables that we looked at in the project. So here's T account, and we can see here's our shared methods. And this is where we need to get a little smarter with our prepared statements that we're not doing yet, because we are just doing a straight SQL statement with an SQL select. Ideally, this should be a prepared statement. The same thing with the list. These are all shared methods, and we've got two things that we can do filters on by criteria. So this is the where clause, and we also have an order by clause. And again, we should probably be smarter here with our prepared statements. We just haven't done it yet. And honestly, we don't use the standard error checking anymore. We've got overrides for the SQL select. Again, I think that'll be an option in our gen coming up soon, because when we use this, we spend a good half an hour going through and doing overriding these things and just returning them and erasing all this stuff. So essentially what we do on the list is we create an object, we read the record from it, which is just mirroring the stuff from the record set into the object. We create an array, and then we return that array of objects. So it's pretty straightforward. And let's go in here and do a real quick project. And I don't know what the last one's going to be yet. So in our open event of our window, we're just going to call a load method. So we're going to iterate through our list. So we're going to do for each, and we're just going to call t account.list. And if we take a look at our where of what we want in here, we're going to say where active flag is equal to 1. So if we go back in here, and we're going to order by our short account number. So now and for right now, that's where we'll leave it. So now we go list, row tag, and assuming we've done everything right, oh, we haven't added actually, sorry, I forgot one thing. Our app open event. And I never really remember what I named it. And you can see that we very quickly loaded a list box. And it's very cool because it was a that wasn't very long at all to be able to do a list. Now, if we wanted to, since the object is right there, we can create a real quick editor for this. Let me go in, and I'm actually going to copy this from another table or another project here, so forgive me. So we're going to create an account, a dialog, which is a modal window. Here's a short account, here's account name, here's account type, and whether it's active. Now, if we look at it, we've got a display method. So we're going to pass in our object, we're going to do the load, we're going to do the display, and the load, we're loading up our UI, we're doing a save, and then we're doing our validate. Now the save doesn't care if it's a new record or not. And now let's go back into our window, and in here we're going to say add, double click, and our sanity check to make sure that if we double click somewhere else, we don't have anything. And now, sorry, UI is in the way. And now if we double click on one of these, we can see that we opened it up, and we can change the account type. We can change this to A. But one of the things that we didn't do, and my bad for not doing this, need to reload that list, which will requery the database. And we can see we got 3A. Oh, that's the wrong one. And now we're going to do Bob's test, and we'll call this revenue. And you can see that it changed all that. So in reality, it is pretty easy to use, and it makes creating UI really, really fast. If you have any questions, let me know. One question that was on here, can I use multiple databases? The answer is yes. And the trick behind it is when you create your namespace for the second set of classes, you're going to want to have a different namespace. So you will have all of this, you'll have this and all the classes for the tables underneath it, as well as all of the methods. One of the things that you really want to do though is make this a private property. So, and then have an overall, well, I'm sorry, not private, but protected, so that there's no chance of the global database object from each namespace of getting confused. And I know we've done this a number of times. We had one project where the audit trail was actually in a separate database, and because of that, it required a separate namespace. So we've had as many as 3 namespaces in the same project. And if you look at the, here's the ActiveRecord base class. If you look at the supers of the tables underneath it, we've got the data.ActiveRecord base. And if you're using a different namespace, obviously it would be the namespace of that class or of that module with the ActiveRecord base. So if you've got any more questions, feel free to email me at support@BKeeney.com. If you want to download ActiveRecord, which is free, you can go to BKeeney.com/rbinto/ActiveRecord. And if you want to look at RGen, there's the utility for that. It's I'm finding that there's lots of people that are using it. I get an email once or every other day on how it's used and how we can make it better, and we are listening, and we're hoping to do it. And certainly, since it's open source, you can, you know, do whatever you want to it, and highly recommend it. So if that's all the questions, thank you for having me on today, and I hope you guys get something out of ActiveRecord and it serves your needs. Okay, so somebody asked, I can only retrieve a record by record ID. In some databases, I have a UUID as a primary key. And is the UUID going to be possible in the future? Possible, yes. What we've done is we're actually using UUIDs on a couple of projects because we're doing database syncing. And what we've done is we still have the primary key, but we generate our UUID. And that lets us use ActiveRecord the way it is right now. It's a possibility that we'll do that. Not all databases really kind of support the UUID as primary key at this point, but that's something we're looking at. And if you've got an issue with it, feel free to email me and we can talk more about it.
All right, thanks, Bob. That was great. Very interesting stuff.
All right, thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me on.
And for everyone that was here, or if you tuned in late, this recording of this webinar will be on the Xojo YouTube channel later this week at youtube.com/GoXojo. Thanks again, Bob. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, you too.